Welcome to Novelty Show, the podcast where we spill the truth about the ups and downs of writing and the ins and outs of the publishing industry. I'm Kat.
I'm Lainey.
I'm Alexa, and this is episode 7, Research.
We'd like to start this episode by thanking our patrons for voting on this topic, and stay tuned to the end of the show where we'll answer our Patreon question of the week.
All right, research. This is a fun, juicy topic.
I'm really excited.
This is your guys' wheelhouse, I guess.
I love research. It's one of my favorite parts. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what research means when it comes to writing books, to writing novels. You know, we're writing fiction. What research are we doing?
Well, no fiction exists in a vacuum. Everything is based on something, and in certain genres, of course, it's literally based on real things. But even high fantasy, the reader brings reality to the reading experience. So there are definitely things that you need to check out to make sure that you're marginally accurate about, I don't know, human psychology, emotions, history, culture. There's lots of stuff.
Something that we mentioned in our previous episode on world building was about all the different sort of factors of world building, and this crosses over heavily into research. So let's talk a little bit about what specific things we tend to research for our books.
For my projects, I tend to always find something in history that really fascinates me, and that's what I'll do a preliminary research on. Like one of my projects, I immediately start researching the Industrial Revolution because that's something that was a huge part of my world building, and I wanted to kind of make sure that at least the atmosphere of when I was drafting felt that kind of industrial-like.
So in that sense, research isn't just getting concrete facts. Sometimes it's just a feel of something.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was like, it's research as inspiration, not necessarily a fact check.
When it comes to specific research, the preliminary stuff that I do is definitely atmosphere and feeling. And later drafts, I go more into the factual accuracies of the research that I need to put into the project.
So how do you find the balance of, including factual things and, using facts as inspiration and making stuff up? I
don't know. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I was thinking of this earlier and I was like, I don't know how I find the balance. I just feel it out.
Well, I think that's part of the magic of writing, of creative writing. We just figure it out. It's something that's hard to explain. It's just something that you figure out the balance on your own as you're kind of working on something.
Yeah, like there's some things that I know I have to be really accurate about, especially when it comes to like my pirate project. I wanted to make sure that the things with like the ships and the sailing terms were all correct. But then when it comes to things like, I guess with politics and like hierarchies, any other kind of social standings, I know that there's like specific rules for like certain, like especially with fantasy, like the hierarchy, like the kings and the dukes and the lords and everything like that. And I kind of morph something into what I think fits my story better with that. It doesn't necessarily follow the rules that have kind of been laid out for that kind of social hierarchy.
I did the same thing essentially with science, for science fiction, and this is a huge aspect of science fiction, of whether you go hard or soft. You do your research, or sometimes you don't. We'll talk about that. And you decide, well, how liberal am I going to be with essentially injecting a little bit of fantasy into the science? And so for Brightly Burning and The Stars We Steal, I went real hand-wavy, and part of my decision-making between research and implementation on the page was, well, it doesn't matter if it's not technically possible to do XYZ in space. I'm just going to say you can, because why not?
Right.
And so there's definitely kind of that line there. But in terms of the decision-making process, it's like my hand-waviness was, well, they have gravity because I say they do, and I say they do because there's a gravity stabilizer. Ooh, hand-waving. But in a scene where there was a malfunction in an airlock and issues with oxygen and nitrogen, and like I wanted to create a life or death, high stakes thing, I stuck to real science there. And I had a friend who knows more about science than I do basically fact check that for me. I did research, wrote it one way, messed it up, and then had the beta be like, well, actually, this is how science works. Like in that scene, I wanted it to have the high stakes of realism.
That makes sense.
And I think indeed the depth of your research, what you research, and then the choices you make about research really varies by genre. Like, it depends on genre and what you're writing. Like, if you're writing a historical, you need to do a lot more research and you need to be much more accurate. But fantasy adds a lot of leeway, as does science fiction.
Honestly, that's one of the things that intimidates me about writing historical, because it's so based in fact, and there are so many people who are very knowledgeable and passionate about different areas of history. Like, if you get something wrong, they are going to know, and they are going to call you out on it, possibly.
That's literally what I had to do with my project that I am working on right now. It technically could be a historical, but I didn't want to follow the rules of an actual historical genre because I knew I was going to mess up some things, and I wanted to have that leeway of making up my own things. So I made it fantasy.
Right.
Just so that I could control more things and suspend belief in some of the aspects of the book.
That's what I like to do as well. That's why most of my research is not just about like mining for facts, but mining for inspiration. And then I can like tweak it a little bit for my story.
Well, and what's great when you're making those choices for genre, it not only makes it, of course, easier in the writing process, but the readers are more forgiving when there is more leeway in it. So, for example, I'm reading a historical right now. I'm reading historical YA. And every time I come across something that's very specific, I'm like, did she research that? Is that accurate? If I look that up, is that like a thing? And I think that you do come under more scrutiny when you choose to write in genres that essentially require research. And if you don't do the due diligence of the research and you don't do it well, the story falls apart. The book doesn't work.
Yeah, that's something we have a little bit later in the outline about genre expectations and conventions that you kind of have to follow. Like, if you're writing a romance, to classify it as a romance, then it has to end with a happily ever after or a happily for now kind of ending. That's what makes a romance. It's one of the conventions of the genre. And with historical, it's the same thing. Readers of historical fiction are there for that heavily researched, accurate world building. So you have to deliver that if you're going to call it historical. So in addition to world building, sometimes you need to research things for your character. From their name to their hobbies, their passions. What kind of things have you guys done research for characters?
When I'm crafting my characters, especially when it's contemporary or contemporary adjacent, but even in genre, I like to give them specific hobbies, interests, or talents because it just makes them feel more anchored and real. But I don't always like it to be something that I already do or I'm an expert in because, we all want to avoid self-inserts. And so for my most recent one, I decided that my main character would row crew. And I didn't go overboard with research, but I definitely wanted to do kind of the bare minimum to get a sense of what would the schedule be like? What is a boathouse like? I had to look up what they look like because I needed one on campus. What would my campus need to look like to facilitate a boathouse? What schools have crew teams? And that actually kind of led me down the path of making it a boarding school. So your research can lead to all sorts of other things and spiral out as well.
And it's the same for hobbies and things like weapons. This is one that I've heard come from other fantasy authors and thriller authors, that if a character is using a gun improperly, anyone who knows how to use a gun properly will know that and point it out.
Yeah, that came up for me with my thriller as well. I have a cop character, and so I had to do research into, well, what would a cop say? How would they conduct themselves? As well as the law in Massachusetts, because I wanted my cop to be making idle threats and kind of stirring up conflict, but it had to be accurate to the laws in Massachusetts and what a cop would actually do and say.
I'm currently neck deep in research on poisons. Yeah, this is like the most research I've done into like a character. I hesitate to say hobby, but it is a hobby for this character.
I like them already.
Yeah, I had a really difficult time trying to find like really good information. And then one of my critique partners sent me this book. She's like, girl, you're gonna want to buy this book because it's all about poison in like the royal courts and throughout history. And
I want to read this.
yeah, it's called The Royal Art of Poison by Eleanor Herman.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, so like Eleanor Herman is also a YA author, but she also has like this huge lexicon of historical nonfiction information of like lesser known like women, and it's just really cool. I was checking out all of her stuff and I ended up buying another one of her books, but she has a way of writing humorously, so it's making the nonfiction part of it kind of fun because it's really voicey for a nonfiction and has really good information in it. But it took me months to try to find something that would relate to the research that I was looking for, and I wasn't even the one to find it. It was a critique partner.
I think that brings up an interesting topic, which is the limitations of the internet. I think that we've come into an age where people just assume everything you could possibly need is on the internet. And while a lot of stuff is on the internet, you can't beat good old-fashioned book research, which back in the day was the only way to research anything. You went to your library and you had to physically pick up books. And I also have found that some of the best information is in nonfiction that I've purchased because I haven't quite found what I wanted. And, you know, you get first-person accounts or memoir or just entertainingly written, highly researched nonfiction. You just can't beat it.
I find that as much as I love internet researching, I do it all the time. It's more of like a quick, fast information version of it. Like, I need to find this quick answer. What's so-and-so called? But then if I want something that's like really, really in-depth, books are the way to go.
Do you guys ever really immerse yourself into like fall down a research hole for hours, days, weeks at a time? Because I have definitely done that before, researching different characters' hobbies. I remember years ago in one of my books, I wanted one of my characters to be a coupon clipper. So I had to like really learn how that worked, and like I had to do research, and almost I didn't actually do it myself, but I had to do the research to the point where I was prepared to go do it myself, and I knew like what coupon booklets to get and like how they researched and organized and did all of that stuff. So do you guys ever fall down any deep research holes?
Absolutely.
I don't think ever to that extent. Like, I've never done like something hands-on yet. Like I've never, I don't know, shot a gun because my character has a gun, or I've never like learned to fight with a staff because my character does that. But I mean, I'd like to, but resources are rather limited in Iowa, so.
I have fallen down two specific research holes that were so bad they got me off track for the project I was working on and ultimately didn't even materialize in writing a book. And I hold them as like deep knowledge for something in the future. The first one was years and years ago. So this is before I ever wrote a novel that ended up getting published. I love spycraft and I wanted to write a spy book. I still do. But I fell down a mid 20th century British Russian spy hole where I bought all of this nonfiction, primarily like exposés by Soviet spies written in like the 90s and 2000s, and I just devoured these books and then never wrote the book. I just read some really good nonfiction about spycraft. I have recommendations, they're amazing. And Russian royalty. I fell down a European Russian, like German European royalty hole, where I read a 700-page biography of the Romanovs and a book on Ludwig II. And then I sold my book. This was for practical reasons, and was like, oh, I'm no longer writing a fantasy. I have to write a sci-fi next. And so I fell down a research hole and never went back to the fantasy the research was for. I might someday. I hope so.
Have you guys ever done any research that ended up poking a hole in your plot? Like, was there ever an instance where you accidentally uncovered something and you realized that it just completely derailed your story?
Yes. It turns out the age of consent in Massachusetts is 16, which means a character in my book was not guilty of statutory rape. He's just a garbage human.
Well, this is why I write fantasy. Because if I run into this problem, I'm really good at figuring out how I can get away with how I still wanted to write it.
Yeah, same. I haven't encountered this personally in my own writing because I just use it as an excuse to find a loophole to make what I want to work anyways. But I have read several books where even if I wasn't super familiar with the topic at hand, I could still tell, like, that's not how that works. And I knew that something about that plot point wasn't realistic. One example was a book that I actually haven't read, so I'm not going to name it, but I heard about this. There's a plot point involving a YouTuber who uploads a video to their channel.
Oh no.
And as a YouTuber, I could tell that, like, it wouldn't have gone down like that. It involved, like, accidentally uploading unedited footage, and, like, someone else had uploaded it, and I was just like, that would never happen.
I've run into that. I ran into that recently with a book that messed up college admissions. And it was so clear that the author hadn't done any research. They didn't even try. And it invalidated almost the whole book for me. I was like, no, I now believe nothing.
Right.
I have an example too, and this one's really good. I also didn't read this book, but my friend was telling me about it, that it was kind of like a spy romance, and the girl wanted to change up her hair. So she literally went from black hair to bleach blonde hair with one bottle of dye. And I'm just like...
No. And it was home dye? No.
Yes, in like a bathroom. And I'm like, girl, that is not how it works.
No, not at all.
Hairdresser fail.
So that kind of covers some various perspectives on researching character hobbies and interests. But let's talk a little bit about character names, because that's we've talked about this before. That's always something fun to dive into. Like, where do you get your character names? How much research do you do there?
I will go through lists and lists until I find that one perfect one. And I actually don't really go too much into the meaning of the name. Mine has to be like a gut reaction to the actual name, and then I'll look up like, oh, what does this name mean? But that's not like the most important. It's definitely a feeling for me. What name clicks with the character envisioned in my head?
Right. My method is very similar. I usually do look up the meaning of the name before I settle on it, just to make sure it's not like, you know, a contradiction to what I want their character to be. Like, it doesn't mean something completely opposite of them. Although that could actually be an interesting dynamic, that their name means something that they are just not. But yeah, for me, it's really a feeling. It's the vibe of the name. It's how my main character's name goes with other proper nouns in my story. Just sort of a general tone. I don't do much research about the history of the name or like the cultural background that the name comes from. Not up front anyways. I might do research like that after I've chosen on the name, but usually not up front.
Yeah, the big thing for me when doing more contemporary stories is I want to be very accurate to naming trends for babies at the time that my characters would have been born, just because I'm anal retentive. I want it to feel organic, because what I really hate when I read a book, a contemporary YA specifically, is when the names are names that were popular when the author was young, and not names that would actually be popular among modern day teens. It's like this tiny little thing, but I'm like, it's that extra level of research and care taken that will make the reading experience more organic. What you always want to avoid in terms of not doing your research is anything that kicks the reader out of the story and makes them go, like we were just discussing, oh, they didn't research that. They didn't care enough to make it accurate.
It's kind of like there's this phenomenon. Oh, maybe I'm not saying this right. Uncanny Valley. Do you guys know about this? It's kind of like when it's close to reality, but it's just off enough to feel weird and unsettling. And you do see this a lot in young adult novels when the author is much older. The characters in that novel will have names that are reflective of when that author was growing up. The teenage characters might speak in a way that almost sounds like actual teen speak, that almost sounds like it could be real slang, but a real teenager will look at that and be like, no real teenager would ever talk like that. Like when you get really close, but you're just not quite there.
And this actually brings up another avenue of research that I don't think a lot of people think about, or they don't think of it as research, but it's really, really essential. And we've pounded this point home in multiple episodes at this point, but reading comp titles in your genre, that's research, and it's essential research. It's key for understanding voice in what you're writing, tropes, and kind of what is atmospherically, tonally, etc. right for the book that you're writing.
Though sometimes I have to be careful. I can't.
Yes, this is the caveat.
Yeah, I can't read them too close to when I'm actually drafting it myself. I try to read them when I'm working on something completely different, like a completely different project. Then I can go back and I can read those other things, but I can't do it sometimes while I'm drafting my current project that's closely related to the comp titles.
Yeah, same for me. It's hard to separate them in my head more if I was like working on it and doing research at the same time. Which kind of brings us into the next little subtopic here of how much time do you spend on research before writing versus when you are writing or when you are revising?
I was just talking about this in an Instagram post that I do enough where I'm not overly influenced by what I'm researching. Like, what my current project, it's inspired by the Borgia family from Italy. I did enough research where I could get the general gist of why everybody, kind of hated them, what was corrupt about them, that broad history, but I didn't go deep into it because I didn't want my story to be directly reflective of that.
That's always the line you have to walk with any kind of research, but especially historical research or the comp titles. You need to know enough to know what you know and what you don't know and what's going on. But you have to be careful of subconsciously or even consciously essentially stealing from things or being too derivative. So it's exactly. And to that end, I think that in a lot of cases for me, that is why I do some of that deep research of reading nonfiction or watching documentaries, like really kind of falling down wiki holes for things I find really interesting. I'll do that and tuck that away for years. And it's just like this process where all that deep research or devouring a certain genre of book just percolates. And I kind of like that because the percolation gives me the distance so that whenever I finally arrive on whatever that idea is, that I'm less likely to crib directly from anything.
It reminds me of a quote that I don't know who to attribute this to, but it says, to steal ideas from one person is plagiarism, to steal from many is research. And yeah, I think that that's really spot on, because if you only use like one book or one TV show as your inspiration, then you are going to just by default end up kind of derivative of that. But if
fan fiction,
yeah. But if you read widely, if you watch a whole bunch of stuff, if you do your research from many different sources, then you get to make something more original than just from one source.
Yeah, and in terms of like the literal amount of research, I'm just gonna hazard a guess that I do the least literal research before starting a book out of the three of us.
I don't usually do any research before starting a book.
Well, then you have me beat. Wow.
I watch a lot of movies as like my research, and I say that with air quotes because I know movies aren't entirely accurate.
I don't know. I think movies are great research.
I do too, but I know people are just like, oh, but that's not historically accurate. And I'm just like, I don't care.
It depends on who made the movie.
Yeah.
Some movies and TV shows are actually really accurate. Like, so for example, you could watch Chernobyl, and they actually did an F ton of research. That show's very accurate. So it's just like when you're doing any research for academics, you need to evaluate your source.
Right.
So more power to you.
Lainey, do you do a lot of research beforehand, or is it just movies?
this is kind of like the academic research part of it, is that like when you can like start your research out in Wikipedia, but you don't want to base everything off of Wikipedia.
Right.
Like I'll go through Wikipedia pages and I'll be like, okay, so give me the gist of what I'm trying to do here. And then I'll use that to kind of guide myself through the draft, so I have some type of knowledge, but not all of it. And then after I finish the first draft, then I go really into the documentaries. I'll go into like YouTube videos or nonfiction picture books, which are like my favorite, and other just nonfiction books in general. That's when I'll like really get the research in.
Well, generally, each of us, how many days, weeks, or months do we do of research? I think we're aspiring writers ask this question to kind of figure out the processes that different writers employ. Is everyone has that buzzing question: how much research is too much research? When do you cross the line into procrastination? Mm-hmm. And for me, because of the pantsing I do, I get restless with research, too much pre-planning prep. It's not going to be any more than a week or two for me personally.
Interesting. Yeah, you have me beat because I do very little research before I start. I do very little prep before I start. Like with my current project, I spent 3 days to outline and figure out character names, and I did zero research in those 3 days. It was just like preparing the story. Because I like to do a very fast draft zero and get that an initial rough draft out as quickly as possible. And then after it's out, then I know what things I need to look into and do more research into. And I have at least a working skeleton draft.
Yeah, for me, it all depends on the project that I'm working on. The one that I'm currently working on, it was also kind of something like what you just said, Kat, like a 3-day period where I was actually doing research. I wasn't just like outlining and stuff. But then I'm just like, this is enough, and I'll just jump in and write. But I also do research while I'm drafting. Like, for an example, for like my pirate book, when they step foot on the pirate ship for the first time, I'm like, okay, let me get a rundown here. It was like 10,000 words in, and they're just going on the ship now, and I'm like, time to figure out the terms of what's the ship is, because I don't know.
Right. I had that same point of research in one of my old novels. They get on a ship, and I didn't do research beforehand, so it was a NaNoWriMo draft. It's just full of brackets that are like, figure out how ships work, like it's a sail or something. I don't know.
I had like a diagram in an extra tab next to my draft. Yeah, and so like sometimes I'd click on it and reference it and be like, okay, yeah, that's what it's called. It's called like the quarter deck, and then I'd go back and like I type that in, but I don't do too much. I feel like it seems like I do a lot of research before I draft, but I feel like I really don't almost. It's no more than a week, but it's like less than that. It's like a weekend of binging movies, and then I'm an expert and I'm ready to start writing it.
And it sounds like it's not just research, but also world building for your own story at the same time. Like it's about inspiration as well.
Yeah, I can't really divorce research from the brainstorming that I do. They kind of mesh together. And then I also definitely will do spot research when I hit points in the book, like time to figure out how this works. And then same afterwards as well. There's certain research I save for revision.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys organize your research? Do you have like just a Pinterest board? Do you have a notebook? Is it digital? Is it physical? Like what do you do with your research? Do you just look it up and absorb it and not write anything down? Because that's kind of what I do.
Oh, you've mentioned my love, Pinterest. So I do all three. There's stuff I absorb that just lives in my brain, like the crew stuff. I never wrote that down. There's stuff I create files in my Scrivener document, because there's a section in Scrivener when you make a novel file for like people, places, things, and I create my own subsections, and that's where I do notes on names or anything else that I need, science-y stuff. And then Pinterest, my love, is the third essential kind of leg of research, because that is where I pin architectural references, fashion, really those two things. And specific to fashion, what I love to do is you can find the names for any shade in the universe, any color, and for any sleeve type, neck plunge, fabric, and I use Pinterest for all of that.
Yeah, I Pinterest is definitely like my visual research goes there. And I often write stuff down. I'll jot things down in a notebook, but then also a lot of it just lives in my brain.
Yeah, I use Pinterest as well. I don't think as much as you two. I kind of just use it to get a little bit of visual inspiration, but I don't do much research on it. But yeah, in general, I don't write a lot of stuff down, or if I do, it'll be in my notebook as sort of story Bible things, like so I can reference my own world and like what I've created.
Well, so we're all united on Pinterest. We all use Pinterest as a part of our brainstorming and research process. What other concrete things do we do? Obviously, nonfiction. Lainey and I buy a lot of nonfiction books, but what else?
I like Reddit. I think Reddit is a great place to learn things because there are so many different subreddits. And I use Reddit a lot when I'm researching personal things. Like when I was first interested in going vegan, I found the vegan subreddit and I learned so much from that, and like reading people's personal experiences and their tips and like what they've learned. And there's a subreddit for just about anything. So you can really get a lot of mileage out of Reddit research.
I've never thought of using Reddit as research.
Oh, well, we're about to blow your mind and change your life because
great.
I'm also on the Reddit train. Think about it. It's a vast collection of primary resources. Yeah. And as Kat said, there's a subreddit for everything. And in particular, what I adore with Reddit, and you can Google this, Google whatever you're looking for and AMA, which stands for Ask Me Anything, which are essentially Q&As that Reddit hosts. It's a Reddit convention. And I'll use this for hyper-specific things. So I did AMA, I rode crew. AMA, I attended an elite boarding school. In my dark past, my deep past, I did research for a ballet book because I adore ballet. Another deep subject I haven't gotten to write about yet, but I read AMAs with professional ballet dancers. And that's where you get the details. That's where you get, oh, this is how security worked in my dorm at a boarding school. This is how my feet hurt when I was dancing point. Whatever stuff it is. And I think that in books, details are what make things seem real.
Yeah, and people share things that you would never think of unless you were like really personally experienced with whatever the subject is.
And also I think Reddit speaks to truth being stranger than fiction. I find often, this is the same reason we read nonfiction, of course, real life story, real life things that come from real people. Sometimes they're so fantastic, people wouldn't even believe them if you put them in a book. And that's the kind of stuff I love to ingest and bounce off of, because you can't even put the best stuff in a book because no one would believe you, but it can give you inspiration for what's possible in fiction, inspired by reality.
What else? What other research sources do we like?
I like to watch documentaries on certain subjects, and you can find a lot of documentaries on YouTube. They might be split up in several different parts, but they're still there and you can still watch them. I do that a lot for history and historical times. Also for histories on like fashion of certain time periods. YouTube's a really good source for that too.
Yeah, I definitely use documentaries on YouTube as well for my time travel novel. I just watched as many videos as I could find of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was something that I had in my book, something I was fascinated by as it was, but there was something about watching footage that captured a mood that I wasn't getting from reading nonfiction and primary sources. So that was really helpful.
I mean, even if you were writing a contemporary novel that takes place in a city or a country that you have never been to, you can look at vlogs on YouTube and see someone there and like what exactly they're doing, what they're talking about, the sounds, the smells, and how they describe it. You can find a lot of good. I like YouTube as a research source as well because I spend a lot of time on YouTube, and also you can find videos about just about anything. It's kind of like there's a subreddit for anything. There's a YouTube video for anything.
And jumping off of that, Google Maps to get a sense of a place you might not have been to. You can use Street View.
The one time I was trying to write a contemporary thriller, I I went through Google Maps to like get the neighborhoods down and the streets and what everything looked like more like, because I've never been to Spain, but I can go to Spain via Google Maps.
Right.
And kind of a similar thing that I did for my contemporary, again, for my thriller, I used Zillow to look up fancy houses.
Ooh.
First I used it. Well, I started with Wiki, and I looked up the highest, like, the per capita income in Massachusetts. I needed to pick a place that the richest character would be from. And even though I'm from the area, I wanted the cold hard facts. So I wanted to do the research of, like, what made the most sense. And then I went on Zillow into those zip codes, the wealthiest zip codes in Massachusetts, and I looked at houses for sale, and I then just copied the pictures of the ones that I liked and used that to basically design my dream home, the home where I set the third act of my book. Like, enough happened there that I had to have a firm picture architecturally and layout wise of what the house looked like and what it felt like to move through the space, so that I could describe it. And Zillow was awesome, and it made me wish I had millions of dollars, because houses in Wellesley are amazing.
Another source that I really like, not kind of for research, kind of for inspiration, kind of to just lose yourself in for several hours at a time, and that is TV Tropes, which is a fantastic archive that details just about every trope there is, from the very, very popular ones that have essentially become cliches at this point to tropes that are far less common and might only have a couple of prominent examples in media. So I would definitely recommend TV Tropes. Look up some of the main tropes that you are utilizing in your book and see what other stories, books, movies those tropes have been used in, so you can see how you can do a different approach. You can see how other people did it. Just be prepared to lose several hours of your life to that website, because it's one where you click on something and then you just have to open up 30 more tabs.
Yeah, I'll second that, TV Tropes, because if it wasn't for that website, I wouldn't have gotten my main trope in the current project that I'm working on, because I was like trying to figure out how to get all these different elements that I was thinking into one story, and my critique partner was like, hey, you should check out this website, and that is how I found or refound my favorite trope, which is step siblings. And then that became the pinnacle of this project.
Yeah, and TV Tropes is great because it really dives into the nuance of each trope, and like will cross-reference similar tropes, and you can really learn how to subvert tropes and like flip them around and do something different.
And just another one that pops into my head, I think we discussed this in our character episode, and this plays into another part of research I can't believe I haven't mentioned that I love, which is psychology. And another great resource is the Myers-Briggs test websites, where you can read personality profiles, real life personality profiles, to design characters who aren't like you, but you can get a firm understanding of the psychological profile to make them more rich. And with psychology, I love to research abnormal psychology. And you can do this on personality websites and Reddit. There are subreddits for like people affected by narcissists. There's a sociopath subreddit. I briefly dipped into that one and ran screaming. But there's also some good nonfiction books about sociopaths, by the way, that I can recommend in our show notes. But I love diving into those things because that is one way that I make antagonists a lot more layered. I like the idea of exploring antagonists who have various personality disorders, and it helps me make them both horrific but also real, feeling anchored in what real people would actually do, so that they're less Bond villainy.
Are there any other tools that we know of? Maybe ones that we don't use a ton, that might not rank at the top of our favorites list, but just other options that our listeners might be able to pursue?
Talking to real people.
This is why I prefer the subreddits, though, because I don't like talking to real people. But yeah, I mean, it's even better than a subreddit rather than, going to a website and researching crew. Like, what if you could sit down and talk to someone who does crew and ask them directly all your little questions?
I really should.
Alyssa, didn't you say that you had a rocket scientist read Brightly Burning?
I did. One of my beta readers is a literal rocket scientist. And so instead of it being like research in the sense of asking them questions, interviewing them, I literally had them read the book. And not everyone has that opportunity, but it was pretty great. It was like anti-research. It was like having someone else fact check me.
Well, I mean, that's why things like sensitivity readers or content readers are so important, because it's not just about like a character's cultural background or their sexuality. You can have content readers for a character's hobby.
Research can truly only take you so far. So that's why it is often a good idea to have someone get their eyes on what you've actually written.
So if you were to interview someone, talk to someone real, how do you find or approach that person? Like, where do you find these experts?
Technically, my degree's in journalism, but my least favorite part of my journalism degree was reporting, which is the part where you cold contact strangers. But okay, so one place to start is you look for organizations of expertise. Universities are really great places to go. You ask someone who, is a professor who has academic credentials and whatever you're looking for. You can look to the organization level, like nonprofits, to interview professionals who work in a specific field, for example, or would have that, that expertise. So, for example, the author whose book I read who did zero research on college admissions, she should have Googled it, or she could have gone to College Confidential, or she could have contacted a college consultant or an admissions officer and asked them the question she clearly didn't. And it would have easily fixed these inaccuracies. That's just an example.
Yeah.
Or another great one, I got this from an author. We were on a panel together, Allison Cherry. She's hardcore with research. She's intense, and I respect her. So she wrote a book that takes place at a dog show, like the Westminster Dog Show. So she went to a dog show, and she basically was an investigative reporter. She observed, she took notes in a notebook, she walked up to people and said, "Hey, can I interview you?" And then interviewed them just like a journalist would.
No, that's a great way to go about it. Take a field trip.
That seems so much fun.
So very often it's just as simple as sending an email, just like a professional request, like a business letter, and asking if you could do a Skype session with someone. If they're local, ask to meet them for coffee. I think it's always good to offer to compensate them for their time, especially if they're a professional, whether it's buying them coffee or similar. Most of the time they'll say no need to like pay them, but buying them a coffee is the least you can do.
Yeah, and at least offering it. Like if you say like, I can offer a small honorarium for your time, that at least tells them that you're serious about this. You're not just
Absolutely.
like calling up and being like, hey, quick question for you. Like you really want answers. You really are after something here. It's important to you.
And I'll also give the advice that I think in a lot of cases, it's actually best to do these interviews after you've written the book. Not always. I think it depends on how fundamental it is. But once you've written something and you have a draft, it's easier to ask pointed questions so you're not wasting their time. So you're more prepared.
Yeah, you have a narrower view of what you need to research rather than just,
Exactly.
Where do I start?
So my plan is at some point in this near future to interview students who went to elite boarding schools and ask them the specific questions that have come up where I know there are weaknesses in my draft.
I mean, it can be something smaller and universal like that, like just talking to someone who has been to a boarding school, like what was it actually like? I'm sure there's a subreddit for it, but there's different ways to do research. I read a book that took place primarily in a restaurant, and I could tell that it was very well researched. I worked in a restaurant for 6 years. I could tell that the author either had also worked in a restaurant or had really done their due diligence in figuring out like what it was like to work at a restaurant. So do you guys have any favorite research stories, like any research experiences that really stand out?
I do. It's more of a delightful happenstance thing. So this is for my time travel novel. So this was my first ever completed novel that didn't sell. But I did a lot of research for it because I had my characters. I already mentioned the Berlin Wall. I had them go there. I had an elaborate set piece involving Jane Austen. This is all wish fulfillment. Do you see why this book didn't go anywhere? But I read all these biographies on Jane Austen, and I watched all these documentaries and movies, and it was really kind of delightful how things that I discovered in my research impacted my plot, especially because I am a pantser, and I figure out a lot of details as I go. And what was great with the Jane Austen research specifically, I knew I needed a party, and so I had to use her letters and her biographies to figure out a real party that would have happened in a setting and where it would have been. But reading about her and her favorite brother, there was this like one line that he basically liked to hang out with actors in London. And I was like, that's how they get into the party. I hadn't figured out like what false identity they could use to talk their way in. And I was like, they say they're friends with so-and-so favorite actress. And then I researched who was big on stage at the time. And at that point, when I was researching Austen, because I researched as I went, I'd already written an earlier set piece in the book involving Marie Antoinette's court. And I'm reading this thing about Jane Austen, and it turns out that her favorite brother's wife was related, like sister-in-law, to like a French duke or something who had been in Marie Antoinette's court before she was murdered. And I was like, it gave me this brilliant idea to connect these two instances of time travel. So I was able to have this character in the background of the books, like say, you two look familiar, because they time traveled to a different place that she would have been. And I was just delighted by that. It was this amazing happenstance of research where these two independent historical events that I had just cherry picked were connected. And it's the kind of little detail that if it had been published, there could have been some astute reader who could have been like, oh my gosh, that's real. Research is fun.
I don't know if I have any specific stories that stand out. Just, I love falling down research holes and spending like 3 days being obsessed with something new. But yeah, I've done that a lot of times with a lot of different things, and none of them really stand out as like an exceptional occasion.
Me either. I'm just like so much of an introvert where I'm just going to sit in my room, do my research, and write my book.
Yeah. I do like getting really immersed in doing kind of hands-on research. Like I mentioned earlier, the coupon clip, like extreme couponing kind of thing. I liked researching that and like acting as if I was going to do it.
Recently, when I was like doing research on poison, I like entertained the thought of like maybe doing something, but I'm like, you know what? My internet history is looking real sketchy right now. I'm not ordering anything offline. I'm not doing anything because I'm afraid of what's going to happen.
Right.
So I'm just going to keep reading about it, but I'm not going to do anything about it.
Well, speaking of criminal enterprises, I can tell someone else's favorite research story. My friend Mary Elizabeth, who went on the writing retreat with us, she wrote a book about a con artist, and so she did all this research into grifting, and she actually tested out one of these grifts at Starbucks, and so she knows how to get free coffee from Starbucks based on research she did for her book, and so she put it in her book. So if you read her book, it's the opening scene in the first chapter of her first book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. You can do that. It's a real thing. So go con some coffee off people, but don't poison anyone.
So before we wrap up on our research topic here, can research go too far? And also, I'm wondering, at what point does research become procrastination and you just need to like get going?
Well, that's how research can go too far.
Yeah.
It turns into procrastination. I think that if you're just researching and researching and researching and you never put pen to paper, and it's months and months and months or years that never produces any real writing, any productive writing, then it's gone too far. And not necessarily on that project. If research is stopping you from writing anything, that's when it's a problem. Then you're just a researcher, like a nerd who likes things. You're not a writer. Writers have to write.
Yeah, if you're waiting until you're 100% ready, that might not ever happen. You have to get kind of comfortable with being not completely ready and moving forward anyways, because if you're not making any progress, it's like you're never going to finish. What Alexa said, you're a researcher, you're not a writer. So there comes a point where like you might not ever feel 100% ready, even if it's a topic that you know in and out. You still might feel like, oh, I might do it wrong. I might do something wrong. And that hesitance is just something that you need to get over and just do it. You have to do the thing.
Yeah, I think we kind of all discussed this so far in the episode that we never feel 100% before we go into drafting. It's what we do is just a jumping off point to form our own stories, and the facts can be added in during revision.
Yeah, revision is a huge point too, because you don't have to stress about getting everything perfectly accurate in that first draft. You have time, you can write the first draft, and then you can do more research and talk to more people and get reader feedback. That's another thing that we've stressed in multiple episodes. Beta reader feedback is invaluable for so many reasons, and it ties back into research as well.
And that's really another way that I do think research can go too far, in the sense that I think if you're so tied up in accuracy that it can actually really suck the life out of fiction, because we are writing fiction, and at a certain point you do have to bend rules or bend reality, make prudent decisions about how much of your research to use versus how much to just spin some words on the page and make it a bit, make it fantastical and make it your own.
Yeah, you don't want to stifle your creativity.
Or bore your readers. Like, even historical fiction has to have a spark to it, and the most talented historical fiction writers, there's all that accuracy in there, but there's still fun stories. It's fiction.
All right, it is time for our Patreon question of the week, and this one comes from Pericula Ludus, who asks, what are your recommendations for making a writing retreat the most productive?
Okay, I actually have good advice here.
You're a veteran, Lainey. I think we've both done 2 writing retreats, right?
Yeah. So the first writing retreat that I went on was the Wanders Writers Retreat, which is like an author tube retreat, and it's run by Jesse Elliott and Evie Driver. And what we did for the first retreat was that I brought this like big poster board, and we all wrote down what we wanted to accomplish over the retreat. It was a tool that we used for accountability. Like we put it on a piece of paper, it said marker, we can't change it, what our goals are, and we kind of hung it up on the wall for the entire retreat. And we were able to put stickers on our little square when we accomplished part of our goal, and it was really fun.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah, we did that at the Madcap retreat I went to. They had a whiteboard, and everyone at the beginning had to say what their goal was.
Lainey sounds more permanent than your whiteboard.
I know, right?
You can erase a whiteboard.
I think it's actually fair to say, though, that your goals can change over the course of a writing retreat. And the key thing is to balance productivity and what you want to accomplish with reality, because I think it can actually stymie your ability to be productive if you beat yourself up for not hitting a lofty goal. I always have like a realistic goal and a stretch goal.
I really liked how at the writing retreat that we went on earlier this year, we had kind of like a work day from like, morning and afternoon. We would all work on writing. But in the evenings, we didn't really try to do much work. Like that was for socializing and talking and sharing our work, which I felt was a nice balance, that we had like dedicated work hours and dedicated, we're going to be drinking during these hours, so we're not going to be working.
It gives you something to look forward to.
And we also did group writing sprints too.
We did, yeah.
And that's always fun and a little competitive, but fun.
This is just kind of a basic pragmatic one, but just in case you haven't thought of it or aren't doing it, it sounds silly, but make sure you bring your headphones, because when you're in a room with a ton of other writers, not everyone's necessarily always going to be writing at the same time or be as quiet as other people. And so just having a mechanism so you can totally tune out and focus. For me, having my headphones and specific playlists, it meant that I could do my writing sprints even if other people were on a break, because your schedules won't always align perfectly at a writing retreat.
I would say it's also useful to have various things you can be doing. For example, like working directly on the document on your computer, but then also having a notebook where you're maybe plotting out the next couple of chapters, just so you have a little bit of variety and you have options. You know, do you want to be on the computer? Do you want to be doing something else? Even working on more than one project is a good option to, you know, always be able to rotate and have something to do.
And then this also sounds kind of obvious, but this is the lesson I learned between my first writing retreat and my second one. As difficult as it is, resist socializing. Something at my first one, I did too much socializing, meaning I allowed myself to flit around and find the people who were on a writing break to talk far too often. And that said, my goal for that writing retreat, one of my goals was socialization with fellow authors, because it was a debut recently published writing retreat. However, I accomplished almost nothing in terms of word count on my draft. And so when I went into my next writing retreat, I was more disciplined with myself. I had to basically say to myself, like a mantra, it's okay if you miss a cool social moment, because you need to get the words done. And so I set myself micro goals, like in the morning, I'm going to write 1,000 words. And if I'm not there at 11:30, it doesn't matter if people have started to make lunch and are having a good time. I have something to do. And I had to do that to get it done.
You know, taking into consideration the other people who are with you on the writing retreat is something to maybe keep in mind as well. Because if you're with a bunch of people who are more interested in socializing, then I know I, for one, am very susceptible to things like that. Like at our writing retreat, Alexa, you had your headphones on and you were working for a lot of it. And that made me go like, oh crap, Alexa's really working, so I better be productive too. Like, it was inspiring. If you surround yourself with people who are like there to be productive and who are there to do a lot of writing, like that energy, you can absorb that.
But another thing we did that I thought was good is we basically decided on, I think it was the second day, that downstairs would be a socializing spot and upstairs would stay like writing focus. So meaning it's good to have spaces because some people do end up on different writing rhythms, and
Right.
you never want one group to feel guilty for taking a break and socializing. So I think it's good to create those spaces, almost like a quiet room versus a social room.
We also took like a walk to reset
That was great.
our mood.
And then we brainstormed a book that we still need to write.
Yeah.
I've thought about that book more than once. I really think we should write it.
It would be really fun.
And then just my last little tip is make sure that your writing retreat is long enough, because there's a natural kind of flow to any social event. And the day you arrive and the day you leave are going to be your least productive days. Those are going to, your travel days are essentially social days. So it's really key to make sure that you have enough solid writing days. So for example, a 3-day weekend, bank on only having one productive writing day. So you might need to make sure your retreat is more like 5 days or 7 days.
All right, that is our episode. Again, thank you to all our patrons for your support. You can check out our page at patreon.com/noveltyshow, where our patrons can suggest topics, ask questions, and vote in polls.
We also broadcast live shows on YouTube. You can subscribe to our channel Novelty Show. Follow us on Twitter at Novelty Show for updates and announcements.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. And we'd really appreciate it if you can rate and review us on iTunes and Google Play. Doing so helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other listeners find us. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, happy writing.